We live in a chaotic moment right now in our cities, and I know some of you are like, man, I've had so many conversations about this. I'm sick of talking about it. I'm sick of hearing about it. Let's just move on. But I'm telling you what's taking place in our area, it's a spiritual matter. It's not just simply a matter of like, oh, there's this political thing happening, and I don't really want to get involved in it. Sometimes our politics need to be they need to be driven by our faith, by our desire to follow Jesus. And so if we don't speak to a current moment, I think we're missing an opportunity. And truthfully, church, I think we're missing an opportunity to be the church. The church was built for hard moments when there is a desire to divide from people that disagree with you, and their desire to keep all of this stuff at arm's length. The church was built for this. Every single letter that you read in the New Testament was written into a tumultuous situation where they were calling them to something more, to not be overcome by what was happening, but to overcome what was happening with good. One of the things I think it's important to say is that our church has always been great about helping, great about it. We get calls all the time asking for help. Steve fields those calls for us, and he is a pushover. He'll give people whatever they want. It's great. No, he's very wise and thoughtful and discerning, but honestly, he deals with this kind of stuff a lot. And so I know a lot of people are in situations where someone they know, someone they care about, or maybe somebody they've heard second or third hand is going through something difficult. We personally know people who are out of work because their business shut down for whatever reason, and they don't have work, and I worry about them providing food and groceries and gas. And so I've tried to interact with people just to find out what they need. So here's my appeal to you is that a lot of people, by the way, let me say this, a lot of you are just quietly doing good, and I don't know, this is probably not a rule, but maybe we could call this Patrick's rule if it is. I do feel like sometimes people who post the most on social media do the least, and people who do the most post the least. Now, maybe that's not always true. Maybe you're the one exception. But I have found that so many people are just quietly going around doing good, and you would be shocked and surprised. You'd be like, oh, I had no idea they were involved in that way. And that does happen a lot. So if you're doing good, if you're helping, if you know people, keep it up. That's awesome. That's part of what makes Minnesota awesome. But if you're just not sure and you know of a situation, please come talk to the staff or elders. We want to know about it. We want to be able to speak into it, to help. We have people who want to rally around needs that are being presented right now. So talk to any elder or staff member. It's kind of like the parents. Remember when you were growing up, you had one no parent, one yes parent? Steve's the yes parent. I'm telling you. He's like, yeah, sure, I'll help. But again, you will. If you heard him interacting with people who need help, you would be very confident in his ability to discern a situation. So I just want to say that. I think Steve may have already gotten out of here. Is Steve here? All right, you know why Steve left? You know why he skedaddled? His daughter is getting married this afternoon. Yes, he's pretty excited. So he got out of here. But you want to know a secret? I'm officiating the wedding, so I got to get out of here too. So Steve would have officiated it, but we all know Steve's a crier. I cannot wait for him to hear this later. And he wouldn't have been able to get through the service, so I'm really honored to be able to do that. It's down in Faribault too, so lovely weather for that. All right. Yeah. Wow. All right, one more thing before we get started. We always want to celebrate any kind of good news, especially as it relates to our church family. And this Wednesday, Camden Stephen was baptized into Christ. I got a picture of it up here. Yes. Camden is over here, and there he is. Not to be outdone, Camden was baptized Wednesday. And then later this week, he asked Bia to marry him. And Bia said no. Just kidding. She said, yeah. You guys got excited too quick. Bia said yes. And so Camden, you are smart. Like, just do all the big things right now. Do your taxes right now. Just do everything that all the big moments in life just should happen right now. We're really, really excited for you guys. Really excited for the choice that you made. All right, let's get started. We're in the book of Acts. If you didn't happen to grab one of these little booklets that we printed, there's still plenty left. They're still in the entryway. You can follow along. The readings are easy. They won't take you more than 10, 15 minutes a day, so you can catch back up if you put a little time and effort and elbow grease into it. What we're going to talk about today is just basically this, that God conspires to draw even the most unlikely people to himself, and we are the most unlikely people. We really are. You might think, well, I grew up in church. My parents were Christian. No, I tell you, you are an unlikely person to follow Jesus, and I'll explain why in just a second. The year was 1976. Gasoline was 59 cents a gallon. Whoa. Happy Days was on TV. Apple Computer was founded. I was not alive, by the way. I just want to make that clear. And there were 16 adults that met in a basement nearby that eventually would become the Woodbury Church of Christ. It was the beginnings of the Woodbury Church of Christ back in 1976. So 2026, this year, is the 50th anniversary of our church. Thank you, Trenton. They broke ground in 1978 at this location, and they met originally back in that fellowship hall where you walk in to come to church, and there's lots of activity and coffee and donuts. That was our original auditorium, and we outgrew that, and we now meet in here, obviously. So if you were in a basement in 1976, and believe it or not, there are 3 members of our church that were there, and they're still here. We have Cindy Medina over there in the corner, Dorita Cannon back in the back, and her husband David Cannon. We're all 3 part of that original group that founded the church. So we want to make sure, more? Am I missing more people? You 2 were in that basement? Wow. I'm so surprised. Okay, Lane Match and Renee were also in that basement too. You guys had to have been just like little kids. 12 years old. Wow, 12 years old, 1976. If you want to know how old Lane is, you got to just do a little math now. I did not know. I tried to do all my research. I'm so sorry, but that's wonderful. So we've got 5 represented. Is that right? There's more? Oh boy, okay, we're getting too detailed here. We got to move on. I wasn't even alive, folks. You know, like the international man of mystery had only recently met my mom and gotten married. So I was not even around. All right, but here's what I wanted to tell you about that. That will relate to what we're going to talk about some today. But we are going to do some celebrating of the church over the last 50 years. But we also want to be doing some imagining of what the church might be in 50 years from now. What could be like? I just can't imagine when little 12-year-old Lane doing whatever he's doing. Did he ever envision this? Like, you know, we had the lyrics on the screen and there was the exploding color. Did you ever think in 1976 someday exploding color on the screen? No, of course not. Like, but what could be? What could be in another 50 years? It's all fascinating. In fact, I kind of envision it. You've seen this meme. It's the conspiracy theory board meme, Charlie Day. He's trying to make all the pieces come together, right? I feel a little bit like that sometimes with church because this is true. I was youth minister for a long time, and in my youth group was Alex May. That was back when he was only like 5'11", and now he's however tall he is. Big old tall Alex May. And then Alex May was a teacher up at Flaming Pine Youth Camp, and he taught my son in his class. And then my son sometimes volunteers for Kingdom Club, and he teaches Alex's son in his class. It's just like, oh, whoa, so cool what God might be doing. And I love how there's this, let's call it a conspiracy of faith. So we want to celebrate that. We want to bask in that, but we want to ask ourselves, what will it be? What will I need to invest? What will we need to dream to see the next 50 years? So when you volunteer to teach a kid's class, when you make coffee, when you fix something, when you organize something, when you clean off the snow off the walkway, all that stuff is part of an investment, a conspiracy of faith to make something wonderful happen. It's never just one thing. It's everything. It's all connected. All right, Acts. We're finally getting to Acts, book of Acts. If you have your Bibles, you're going to want to open them up to Acts chapter 7. Acts has this conspiracy web of faith going on too. Now remember, if you've been here for a couple weeks, last week, we talked about how things were going really, really well at church. Oh, by the way, Steve just came back in. Steve, I talked a lot about you while you were gone. I just want you to know. It was mostly good. All right, so if we talked last week about how things were going pretty well for the church, and then it started to go sideways. It started to get difficult for them. And anytime things are going smoothly at church, if you've ever worked at a church or been at a church, it'll go smoothly for about 15 minutes before something hard comes along and you have to deal with. It's just always the way it is. And when church stuff starts to go sideways, it goes sideways in waves. So last week we talked about Ananias and Sapphira and what a difficult moment, great fear came upon the church. That was Acts 5. Then there are complaints about fairness. Do you remember those few lines where it was talking about how nobody had any needs and everybody shared and everything had everybody in common? Well, it wasn't long before there were parts of the church feeling like other parts of the church really weren't sharing and they weren't getting their fair share. And that's a hard thing to deal with. Then in Acts chapter 7, this will be in this coming week's reading, in Acts chapter 7, a key leader of the church doesn't just die. It's not just like this sad, they passed. They are killed. They are murdered. Now imagine what that would do to our environment if we lived in a culture that wanted to murder members, leaders of our church. And this is what the church is dealing with. They're experiencing this hardship in waves, and it just keeps coming. It keeps coming. In Acts chapter 7, you got to notice this. It is so cool, and if you haven't noticed it in your reading, which unless you're ahead, you wouldn't have got there yet, but in Acts chapter 7, there's this very cinematic episode, this little transition, this pivot. It's so fascinating, and I'm about to spoil a 2,000-year-old story, okay? So maybe you didn't know this, but I think it's amazing. So Stephen, he's one of the guys that was in charge of making sure everybody got what they needed. He was one of the church leaders. He gets arrested because he's just really good at explaining who Jesus is and sharing with people who don't know about Jesus. He's really effective. So the religious leaders of the day, they don't like that. It says they're filled with jealousy, and so they arrest Stephen, and he has to defend himself in front of these religious leaders. And he preaches this chapter-long sermon about Hebrew history, and it's beautiful, and he selects little episodes that they were familiar with, but then he puts this emphasis on it to help them understand that actually they are in the wrong, that Jesus has come, he's here to change the world, and they're on the wrong side of history. It's unbelievable how he does it. And then at the end of the story, in Acts chapter 7, verse 57, he finally brings it. He lands the plane, preaches this amazing sermon. Verse 57, it says at this, the audience that he's preaching to, they covered their ears. I have never experienced that at any of my sermons. Maybe you have felt like plugging your ears, but can you imagine a sermon that was so convicting that the audience was like plugging their ears and yelling at the top of their voices? They all rushed at him and they dragged him out of the city and they began to stone him, which means they picked up rocks and they threw rocks at him until he was dead. Unbelievable story. But Luke does something crucial right here. At the very next line, they begin to stone him, and then it says, meanwhile, and Luke introduces us to another character that we haven't met yet in the story. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. It's good writing. Now, we likely know Saul as Paul. Saul is his Hebrew name. Paul is the Greek version of the name, and we know the Greek version more because he introduces himself to a lot of Greek-speaking peoples as Paul, but it's the same person. So if you're reading Luke's story and you've heard of Paul, you understand who this guy is. Paul did his writing and his work in the 50s and 60s, the first century, 50s and 60s, and Luke wrote Acts in the 70s or 80s, so it's likely that people knew exactly who Paul was. You can almost visualize this moment. You can visualize the camera panning away from the body of Stephen lying there on the ground to spare us the violence. And then the camera pans over to this figure and you see their feet. And as the camera moves up the body of this person, you see that it's someone that you know, someone that you've heard preach, someone who is a hero of the faith in the church. And you realize that this someone participated in the very first murder of a Christ follower. Wow. It is unbelievable, the intricate web of what's happening. Some good writing, Luke, good writing. You have Stephen, the first person to die for following Jesus, and you have Saul, the future apostle, helping. Wow. Boy, talk about conspiracy of faith that God uses these wild, unexpected, even shocking events to further his purposes. Now, let's do a little quick flashback. We're in Acts chapter 7. We're at the very tail end of the chapter. But let's flash back all the way to chapter 1, verse 8. Jesus, before he's ascended, he tells this group of followers that you will be my witnesses. You're going to go around and you're going to tell people about me. And this is where you're going to do it. You're going to do it in Jerusalem. And you're going to do it in Judea. That's the surrounding area. And in Samaria. Little surprise because they don't like the Samaritans. And the ends of the world, the ends of the earth. You're going to take this thing international. The only problem is that the Christians weren't moving. They were in Jerusalem. They weren't going anywhere. They were meeting every day. It was awesome. Things were great for them until Stephen gets killed. But they weren't moving. And Jesus said, I need you to move. He had said in Matthew 28, I need you to go into all the world. And nobody was going anywhere. So then you flash all the way back to the end of chapter 7, Saul is there at the death of Stephen, and then the very next chapter, verse 1, Acts chapter 8, verse 1. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and everybody, except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. We in the church, we tend to think in terms of persecution. We use that term. It kind of tends to relate to religious persecution. But really, if somebody were reporting this today, they would call it religious terrorism. That's how it would be described, going door to door, terrorizing the Christian community for their faith, and the community scatters. It's gone. It leaves, except for the apostles. There's a couple interesting things. Verse 4, if you jump down from verse 1 to verse 4, those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Uses the word scattered twice. Scattered is actually an agricultural term. It means planted, like a farmer planting. Those who had been scattered, like God was planting Christians in different places. Hey, you got to go over here. You're going to Judea. You're going to Samaria. You're going to the ends of the earth. He's scattering Christians different places. He's planting them different places. And then preached, don't think of what I'm doing here up on a stage. You got a bunch of people looking at you. It's just people going around having conversations with their friends and neighbors about this new reality, this new way of being, this new way of living. Now, the thing is, even to this point, we realize that maybe sharing our faith is a common concept, a command, something that we're supposed to do. And you probably have a friend or a neighbor that you've thought, I really need to tell them about Jesus, or I really need to invite them to church, or maybe it's a family member. You've thought about that. But that concept of taking this thing that matters to you and sharing it religiously, spiritually, and sharing it with somebody else, trying to compel somebody else to see the vision of life that you see through Jesus, that's actually relatively unique to Christianity. That wasn't something that existed very commonly prior to Christianity. You see it a little bit here and there, but most religions did not try to, quote unquote, convert people. There were no missionaries for Zeus that would go around proclaiming the name of Zeus and compelling people to try to become Zeusians. That didn't happen. In fact, what generally happened is your country conquered this country, and then you were like, not only are we in charge now, but here are your new gods. These are the gods you have to believe in now. That's really how the spread of anything happened. But something's different here It's a new way of understanding God and yourself. It's not something that is done by compulsion. You don't force this on people. You share this reality, and for some people, there's something about it that they're drawn to and they want to know more about. It's something different. And this disaster of Stephen's death is part of the plan to spread this reality. This would not be my preferred church growth strategy. I'd love to see Woodbury explode and have that's a bad word, grow and have multiple services. Yeah, bad word in light of religious terrorism. I would love to see us get so full that we have to have multiple services going on, or we have to build new buildings or plant new churches. That would be incredible. But if God said, okay, I'm going to kill one of the leaders and I'm going to scatter everybody and that's how I'm going to do it, I would be like, is there an easier way? I don't like that. And which leader? Do you need me to provide a list? I'll give you my top. No, I don't want anybody I don't want any of that to happen. But here's what God is doing. And it's worth saying, especially in Minnesota metro area, that God can use disaster, even evil, to compel us to do what we should have been doing all along. But it makes the lines a lot more clear. I see. I should love my neighbor. I should love my enemy. Okay. So, in chapter 8, Luke gives us two incredible stories, and then just the remaining time that we have is a long introduction. The remaining time we have, we're going to look at these two stories of the gospel being spread, the scattering happening. All right, so remember, we met, we met Stephen. Stephen is killed, but Stephen was just one of a team. He was part of a committee that made sure everybody's needs were taken care of. Another guy on that committee was a guy named Philip. He was another person in this committee. And so the book of Acts takes its attention from Peter and John and the other apostles and focuses it on this relatively unknown guy named Philip and gives us two stories of Philip being planted in different places and what happened. It's very fascinating. All right, Acts chapter 8, verse 5. Philip, who was escaping religious terrorism, remember, went down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. This is probably dumb, but the reason they use the word down, Samaria was actually north, but they used down because it was lower in elevation. So Samaria was north of Jerusalem, lower in elevation. So he goes down to a city in Samaria and proclaimed the Messiah there. It's a little bit of background that would be valuable to know. If you like the teaching stuff, history stuff, you're going to like this. 700 years earlier, so you have Philip, he goes to Samaria. 700 years earlier, Israel, which had been one nation, was split in two. There was civil discontent, unrest. It became two nations. The northern nation kept the name Israel, and the southern nation took the name Judah. They were named after the dominant tribe that had stayed in that region. God kept warning people, hey, you got to stop worshiping false idols, and they didn't. And eventually, Assyria came in and hauled almost everybody from Israel, the northern nation, off, got rid of them. They only left kind of the worst of the worst, people that nobody cared about, people that didn't have any value. So imagine if your nation gets invaded, but you get left. You're probably sad that everybody is gone, but I wonder, are you a little sad like you weren't even good enough to be exiled? You were just nothing. You didn't matter at all. So there were some Israelite people left. And then Assyria, just to make sure that nobody got any crazy ideas, they would take people from a bunch of other nations they had conquered, and they would plant them in this new place. And so this northern kingdom that had been full of Israelites became it was a melting pot of all kinds of people. And the religion became a melting pot too. So they still worshiped Yahweh, the one true God. But then it was mixed in sometimes with these different borrowed elements from different countries and different religions. So the people in the south who wanted to be pure and worship the right way had a lot of disdain for the people in the north because they weren't purely Hebrew people and they didn't worship quite the right way. So there was a ton of animosity. That northern group became what we know as the Samaritans. Everything got all mixed up. And it's kind of funny, but you can understand the animosity that might exist. And it's why we have the story of the Good Samaritan. Jesus tried to take someone who exemplified someone that everybody else would think is a bad person and says, that person is who I want to point out as being good. It's funny because we are like, well, what's that? We live in a melting pot. We live in a pretty diverse place. We live in a region of the country that has a lot of differences, and hopefully we allow for and accommodate and often celebrate those differences. But there's some people who don't like differences, and if you don't, see, we would look at this and we're like, I don't really understand the distinction. Everybody's worshiping Yahweh, so what's the big deal? But there are people who get really upset about minor distinctions. Like if you're into karate and I went up to you and I said, hey, how's the kung fu going? You would probably get offended. Karate and kung fu are very different things, Patrick. Well, I don't know. I have no idea about it. Some people get really offended if they want a Coke and you offer them a Pepsi. I know. This is going to divide the room. This is probably not going to, I'm going to have everybody against me. They're not that different. And some of you are like, I really enjoyed going to church here, Patrick, but I think it's time for me to move on. It's not that different. But those small differences sometimes make a big deal to people, and that's what was happening between Judea. They took on, it ended up, the language changed slightly. Judea, southern kingdom, Samaritans, northern kingdom. They weren't kingdoms anymore because they were all owned and run by Rome. All right, I say all that to say for Philip to go from here to up there was a big deal. Jesus had done it, but Jesus was kind of wild. He would do crazy things that not everybody else would do. For Philip to do it, wild. So in Acts chapter 8, verse 9, Philip's crossing all kinds of societal norms. Acts chapter 8, verse 9. Now for some time, a man named Simon had practiced sorcery in the city and was amazed all the people of Samaria. He boasted that he was someone great. So you have Simon, he's a magician, but he's using this magic illusion ability to try to convince somebody that he's pretty awesome. Verse 10, all the people, both high and low, gave him their attention. They exclaimed, this man is rightly called the great power of God. They followed him because he had amazed them for a long time with his sorcery. Jump down to verse 13. Philip comes, starts talking about Jesus. Verse 13, even Simon himself believed. And after being baptized, he continued on with Philip, and he observed signs and great miracles taking place. He was constantly amazed. He was looking at this and saying, I know what I was doing, and that's just smoke and mirrors and tricks, but man, there is something real here. Even Simon, Luke is trying to draw our attention to the fact that this just wasn't another convert. Even Simon, can you believe Simon? If we knew Simon, we'd be like, really? Simon was converted? Even Simon? That's what Luke is trying to communicate here. Christians and non-Christians often have a caricature of what a good Christian is. I don't know, maybe they think of Ned Flanders from The Simpsons. Right? He's a good Christian. Some of you are like, I have no idea who that is. Angela Martin from The Office? No? Okay, whatever. Doesn't matter. But they have this concept that a good Christian's kind of a goody two-shoes, and they always do the right thing, and they always use their blinker, and they make a complete stop at the stop sign, and they always tip 20%, and, just whatever, the good Christian. Sometimes we know someone, like a coworker, a classmate, and we think they would make a good Christian. What we're often saying with that is that person is already almost a Christian. They're very similar. They wouldn't come here and be weirded out. They're a pretty good person. They put the shopping cart back. They do good things anyway, and so they would make a quote-unquote good Christian because they'd fit right in. They're Christian adjacent. They're near Christian. It's just a small step for them to become a Christian. That's sometimes what we mean when we say something like they'd make a good Christian. They'd be a good Christian because they're already so close. Early in my preaching career, I was preaching at a different church in a different state, and I made a fundamental preaching mistake. I assumed I knew my audience, and I assumed my audience was full of complacent Christians who needed to be roused out of their complacency. And I assumed that they probably thought our sins aren't as bad as other people's sins. So sure, we do some things that aren't good, but they're not as bad as these people over there. And so I got up and I was preaching to this group of people, and I said, I know we think our sins aren't that bad. It's not like any of us have ever murdered anyone, because I assumed that this was just a bunch of pretty good people who just maybe needed to get a little better. After the sermon, my friend who had invited me down to preach pulled me aside, and he's like, hey, I got to tell you, there was a guy in the audience. He spent 25 years in prison for murder, just got out, came to hear you preach. And I'm like, whoops, well, that's, so now I don't assume that maybe nobody in the room has murdered anybody. Some of you look like you probably have. You never know. My fundamental point, I think, was right, but my mistake was assuming that these people just needed a little bit more and they would be more Christian. We're not trying to make everybody like Ned Flanders. You know who would make a good Christian? Everyone. Everyone. We need even people. We need you to think of the person that you're like, they would never darken the doors. That's the person we want to pray for. That's the person we want to help. That's the person we want to talk to about Jesus. We need you to be thinking about people who they think, there's literally people who have thought, if I step into the church building, God will strike it with lightning. That's the people we need in here. We need people who feel like they're too far gone and God can't forgive them of their sin, but they're willing to give it a shot. We need people who grew up in the faith but then walked away from the faith, but now they're retesting the waters. We need people who have never left and are welcoming those folks back with open arms. We need people who are burned out. We need people who have hang-ups. We need people who disagree because they're frustrated about what they've seen in the church. We need people who have been here forever. We need people who are in the basement in 1976 and who are still here. We need everyone. The gospel, the truth, the reality is for everyone. We don't want to look at someone and say they would make a good Christian, because everyone would make a good Christian. Everyone has these opportunities, and we don't even know what's going on in somebody's mind. Everybody's given these opportunities to respond to what God might be doing. I want you to think, this is helpful for me. Sometimes I do this, is I think about Bible verses like this, and I think about, what if I put a different name in there? What if instead of Simon, even Simon, what if it was even fill in the blank? Even someone else believed. Who's that person that you're like, I just can't imagine it? Well, let's think about them. Let's pray for them. Let's talk to them. Let's interact with them. Take that least likely person and just imagine. This is kind of a fun thing to do. Imagine that least likely person and just imagine them reading their Bible. Just they wouldn't crack open the scriptures, but imagine if they did. Imagine them attending a Sunday morning. Oh, they would never. Patrick, they would hate it. But imagine them beginning to mouth the words of one of the songs that we're singing. What would that do to your heart if you saw that, if you were able to witness that? If God were to use you to scatter, to share the truth, and it helps someone, and even someone, and they begin to worship Jesus. What would it do if you saw that person and they maybe raise their hand during a worship song? We need that kind of spirit-filled imagination to see what God might do over the next 50 years. Simon, actually, in the story, proves he immediately doesn't get it. He doesn't get it at all. He doesn't get it. And Peter has to harshly correct him. And the story is very, very interesting. We won't read it, but he proves that it's fine. I've told this story before, but when I was a kid at our church, a new family came in, and because, you know where there's always open seating at church? Not always. I know sometimes you guys sit there. Now you felt bad that you didn't sit there today, right? Bam, 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 all open. New family came in, and they sat in the front row. Well, this was a church back in the day. Remember, we used to pass the communion trays, and they had the communion. Some churches break it up. They pre-break up the communion for you. Some churches leave it in a big old cracker, and you have to break it yourself. Every church is wildly different. And this family who had never been to church before, they had the communion tray, and the guy passing it handed it to them, and they're like, I don't know, we don't know what to do. You can't like turn, you don't want to ask, like, what do we do here? And so they just took the whole cracker and ate the whole thing. The communion that was meant for everybody at church, they ate it all. This was an unprecedented situation. The men passing the trays, they had not been briefed on something like this. What do we do when? Because they didn't know, and that's wonderful. We want people who don't know, who don't have it all figured out. Can I tell you, just if you're a visitor here, you can just listen in. But members, I want to remind you of something. When a visitor walks through the doors of the building, it took them an incredible amount of courage to do that. Even if you grew up in church and you just moved to the area and you were trying Woodbury for the first time, you know it was a little bit like, what's going to happen? And you walk in those doors and you're like, where do I go? Do I follow the kids? Or there's this other hallway? There's donuts? Do I have to pay? Is coffee? Is that free? Is it good? I don't know. And then hopefully somebody will say hi to me or talk to me or interact with me in some way. And then you walk into this room and you're like, can I sit here? Because I don't know. Maybe that's somebody's favorite seat, and that could be really offensive to them. Let me just tell you what, you can always sit on the front row. It's always available. But it takes a tremendous amount of courage, and I think we should honor that courage with genuine, heartfelt welcome. Some of you may be thinking, man, if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be here, I'd be here. All right, I told you there's going to be two stories. We're going to pivot this morning because I spent so much time in that first one. You're just going to have to read that second story. It's really good. It's about an Ethiopian chief finance officer that is a worshiper of God, and the gospel actually spreads not just beyond the borders of Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, but starts to go international. It's a great story. I wish I could tell you all about it because I got so many cool notes, but we're out of time. What I want to wrap up with this, and maybe we'll talk about, maybe we'll incorporate some of that in an upcoming series. This is what I want to wrap up with. Philip, when he started preaching in Samaria, and Philip, when he started preaching to this Ethiopian man, leader, powerful person, had no idea what would unfold. He had no clue what would transpire from these conversations. And the truth is, neither do you. With that coworker, with that friend, I know sometimes we're worried about breaking the ice with them because what if they reject it? What if? But you don't know what will transpire. My guess is Dorita and others had no idea what would transpire when they first met in that basement. They had no idea. 16 adults. We have about 250 people that call Woodbury home now. They had no idea. I don't know that they got up and thought, yes, someday it will be this and it will look like this. Well, we don't know. It's not that God lacks the power to do incredible things. It's that we lack the imagination. And when we lack that imagination, sometimes we lack the willingness to try, the willingness to do. 16 people in 1976. What does the next 50 years have in store? And it may not be even that conversation you have. It may just be the investment you make in teaching a kid. Who knows what that kid is going to do and be and become? And the ways that your moment of presence and kindness and interaction with them will make a lasting impact on them. Maybe it's supplying snacks for youth group or being a greeter. I'm going to ask the praise team to come back up, and we're going to wrap up with a song called Blessed Be Your Name. And it's a good song to sing for a variety of reasons. It's a good song, but one of the reasons it's good is because it takes the words of Job, who's going through tremendous difficulty, and he's reminding himself to praise God anyway. And so what we want to do is we want to remind ourselves that what our cities are going through may be difficult, but we praise God anyway. We're a light anyway. We do good anyway. Maybe what you're going through, maybe you're like, I'm tired of hearing about everything that's going on in my life. I got stuff going on. Well, yeah, let's praise God anyway. Would you stand and sing as we close out?